Welcome. I'm Joan Shear from the Boston College Law Library, and I'm talking today with Ray Madoff, author of Immortality in the Law, The Rising Power of the American Dead. Ray, I've told you before how much I like your book, and the thing I want to know that's not in the book is what surprised you most when you researched this book?
Oh, that's a great question. I think the book was really full of surprises for me. First of all, the book is not the book that I intended to write at all. It actually is it was intended to be the first chapter of what was going to be a much larger book. So the book was interested in the question about, why does the law protect interests of the dead? And I teach trust and estates, so I knew that in some areas the law protected interests of the dead, in some areas it didn't, and I was interested in exploring kind of the whys and why nots of this. And I thought that I wouldn't be able to find very much interesting in the law. I would just be able to have, so my plan was to have one chapter about the law of the dead and look at things like the body and property and reputation, and it was going to be about 30 pages. And then after that chapter, I was going to look to other disciplines to try to explain why law recognizes the interest that it does. And I thought that the first chapter would look to philosophy and the question of, can the dead be harmed? There's actually been a lot of writing about that. And in fact, when I got the contract from Yale for the book, it was based on the chapter that looked at the philosophical arguments of, can the dead be harmed? Then the next chapter was going to be looking at psychology. Why, for psychology reasons, do we recognize interests of the dead? I thought I'd talk about Freud and Robert Lifton and various people like that. And then I was going to look at sociology and this fellow named Zygmunt Bauman, who was a Polish social theorist who wrote a lot about why societies recognize interests of the dead. And then I didn't know whether or not I had to do religion, but that was the idea. The arc of the book was going to be one chapter on the law, and then all of these other chapters that were going to look at it through different lenses of different disciplines, and in the end I'd come up with some reasons for why the law did what it did. And what happened was, and what really surprised me about the book, is I started to write the very first chapter, which is about the law of the body. At the time, I thought it was going to be like 3 paragraphs. And I thought that the 3 paragraphs were going to say something like, which is what I understood from Trust and Estates, which is you can leave instructions regarding what happens to your body, but the law may or may not listen. And that's about it. And I thought, okay, I've got to stretch that out to 3 paragraphs. How am I going to do it? And I might have even met with you because I was looking for some basic support about this idea of the law of the body. And I looked at some really embarrassing sources. Corpus Juris Secundum, right? Is there anybody that uses that anymore? ALR, you know, the real basic, the real Encyclopedia Britannica for lawyers. And I came across the phrase corpus nullius in bonus, which means the body belongs to no one. And so that made clear to me that the reason we have this idea that you can leave instructions but they're not really binding is because we are actually grounded in this tradition that we don't in fact own our bodies, and we therefore don't have legal control over them in any way. And this rule, corpus nullius in bonus, turns out has tremendous impact in all different areas of the law governing the body. And I started to trace this question by having that phrase and tracing the question of the history of the law of the body, and I found one unbelievable story after another. I found out about grave robbery, something I had never really understood much about before, and about organ transplants and posthumous procreation and cryonics and all of this stuff. I just couldn't believe the array of stories that I found. You know, why Harvard Law School is in Boston instead of Cambridge, because they needed to get the bodies for anatomical study. You know, I found one unbelievable thing after another, and it was basically like 67 pages later, I realized, okay, this is not going to be 2 paragraphs anymore. This is going to be a much bigger project. And then what I was really thrilled to find, but surprised, was that as I turned to each section, so then I finished body, and I thought, wow, that was a ride. That was an amazing, all these stories were so amazing and interesting. And then I started to turn to property, and I thought, well, that's the end of the interesting stuff. But then even in property, I began to find these incredible stories about the history of controlling property and property for charitable purposes. And I found out stories about Alfred Nobel and how he had been, how he read his own obituary that called him the merchant of death, and how that prompted him to, one can surmise, to set up the Nobel Foundation. And just all these stories, everywhere I turned, I found unbelievable stories. And I realized that this thing that I thought was going to be one chapter was in fact 4 chapters, and that they themselves told this very comprehensive story about the law of the dead, a story that I had no idea existed at the time that I began doing my research.
So do you desire to write the rest of that other book in your spare time?
You know, that is a really good question. I've often thought about that. Like, do I want to go on with those other things? And I've actually sort of I'd say I lost my taste for it, in part because I've become very interested in the substantive aspects of the law of the dead and the ways in which we give control to the dead. And as I talk about in the book, the very real costs that I think it imposes on the living.
Well, your title, Immortality in the Law, is there any way to achieve any kind of immortality?
Well, you know, I think what's interesting is that the law is now promising immortality in lots of ways that we historically didn't, right? So, and particularly for property owners. So if somebody owns a lot of wealth, we tell them, look, you can set up a charitable purpose for whatever purpose you like, and the law will respect those wishes forever. That didn't used to be the case. People and courts specifically said that they did not think it was appropriate to have people to set up perpetuities for whatever they thought good. You couldn't just have some idea. Here's an idea, and let me just create a perpetual entity, you know, to exist forever. So in the charitable sector, people can do that. In the private sector, of course, with the growth of dynasty trusts and the demise of the rule against perpetuities, people can now set aside their money for private uses for essentially forever. And increasingly, things like copyright is extended not to forever, but for a long time. The ability to control your image has been, again, extended for a very long time, if not forever, at least, you know, way out there. So I do think we have a trend towards the law saying, hey, good news, everybody, you can protect your interests forever. But one of the things I try to explore in the book is how, in fact, these promises aren't really fulfilled. And I think that in a way what we're doing is we're selling the American public a bill of goods. We're telling them they can control things forever, but there's all sorts of ways in which people's wills are really undone.
Well, do you think the death tax is aptly named, that little...
Well, I mean, I think it might be aptly named in that it is a tax that is imposed at the time of death. However, I think that the name has been has had some effect on the public, that taxing people at that time is a horrible thing, that we're sort of kicking people when they're down. And the problem with that, where I take issue with it, is that it's not the person who has died who is going to suffer the cost of the tax. The tax is going to be borne by people who receive inherited wealth. And one of the things that I think the public doesn't generally understand is that inherited wealth otherwise passes entirely free of taxes. So if somebody earns $50,000, they pay income taxes. But if somebody inherits $50,000, they don't pay even 1 cent of taxes. Even if they inherit $50 million, they don't pay 1 cent of taxes on that under the income tax system. The only taxes that anybody pays on that would be estate taxes under our current law.
Do you think that our current law needs some overhaul in this area?
I do, because, I mean, in the area of the estate tax, I think that it does. I mean, I think that probably the best way to go at this point would be to abandon the estate tax altogether and to switch to an income tax system that makes it clear that the tax is being imposed on the living instead of on the decedents. Because I think that our current system has been really successfully attacked. The opponents of the estate tax have achieved the rhetorical upper hand. Because the tax is nominally imposed on the decedent, it somehow seems cruel. And so I think that our conversations have really been have been, led astray because of that. Double taxation and all of this stuff that it really isn't. It's really a single form of tax on inherited wealth. And so I think it would be clearer for the public if we actually imposed it that way, and it would be much more likely to be understandable by the public. And then ideally what I'd like to see is to have that taxed at higher rates than earned income, because after all, if somebody just hands you money, I don't think that we should. I think we should tax that more onerously than if somebody works hard in order to earn money.
I look at my notes for a second because I wanted to remember to ask, and now I can't find it. Oh, how do the other countries of the world approach this? Do other countries have estate taxes like we do, or they do income, or?
It's very, very difficult to compare because for example, a lot of the European countries have wealth taxes. So people are subject to tax on all of their wealth every year, an annual wealth tax. And so if you have a system like that, then you don't have to worry quite so much about estate taxes and income taxes because you're already taxing people on accumulated wealth. So part of the problem of the system in the United States is that we don't have any wealth tax. We have, some forms of property tax on a state level, but not a broad-based wealth tax.
Well, back to the dead bodies, which are sort of...
It's Halloween, after all.
It is Halloween today, yes. What about cryonics?
What are you going to say?
Yeah. How does the law get involved? Does the law limit what people can do? I mean...
What's interesting is that in the United States, we don't really, we somewhat limit what people can do, but not as much as in the rest of the world. The rest of the world just prohibits cryonics. It says, look, this is absurd. You're not going to bring somebody back. Therefore, we're not going to allow the sale of some sort of false promise, right, that you can freeze somebody and you pay this company all this money and then there's some hopes of bringing them back. And so throughout most of the world, there's no such thing as cryonics industry. In the United States, however, has been receptive to this. And I think it's because American as a people are quite anti-death. It's really not our thing. And anything that promises that we can, avoid death in some way, we say, okay, fine. If you want to try it, go for it. That's okay with us.
So if I spend enough money, I will be able eventually to come back. And if I can't do that, then I can at least control my money forever.
Well, right. This is what we at least tell people, whether you can actually do it or not. That's a separate question. There's one great quote from Anti-Cryonics, which is that people that believing in cryonics is like believing that you can take a hamburger and turn it into a cow. So
you can't do that?
Yeah.
Well, this has been fascinating, and I urge everybody who is at all interested in trying to live forever, or at least finding out more about the world we live in now, to read Ray's book, Immortality in the Law. It's accessible to everyone, not just lawyers. And thank you, Ray, for being here on Halloween. A good day to talk about dead.
Thank you so much, Joan. My pleasure.